Hello, my name is Philip Comella, and today we're going to have a conversation beyond science and religion.
Breaking new ground in thinking, exploring the outer limits of what we know about the world and ourselves, unhindered by common beliefs and perceptions. This is Conversations Beyond Science and Religion, taking on subjects from the Big Bang, the multiverse, and evolution to the supernatural and the new rising consciousness. This is where scientists, philosophers, New Agers, and spiritualists come together to discuss where this world may be heading. Now here's your host, lawyer, philosopher, and the author of The Collapse of Materialism, Philip Comella.
Now today we're going to have a really interesting and fun show because we're going to tackle probably the most controversial topic in science, which is also known as Darwinian evolution. And it's interesting, I think, to note that over the last century, there have been two legal cases concerning the teaching of evolution in schools, and each represents the sign of their respective time. We probably remember the famous Scopes trial, also known as the Scopes monkey trial, in 1925. And in that case, there was a Tennessee law that made it illegal to teach Darwinian evolution in schools. And so people who opposed that law set up a plaintiff, a teacher, whose name was John Scopes, who was put on trial for teaching Darwinian evolution in school, violating the Tennessee law. This case made Clarence Darrow famous, the famous cross-examiner. He was found guilty, but he was released on a technicality. Okay, so that's the Tennessee law making the teaching of evolution in schools illegal. So over time, as we know, Darwinianism became entrenched in the curriculum, and so now we sort of go the other direction, and there's another trial in 2004. This trial was called Kurtzmiller versus Dover School System, and this time there was a public policy in the Dover school system that required the teaching of intelligent design to be taught alongside Darwinianism, sort of like a competing theory. And the court in that case, this is a federal court, 130-page opinion, he found that the teaching of intelligent design in the school violated the Establishment Clause in the Constitution, which is that there cannot be a law that favors religion taught in a public school. And so intelligent design was ruled out of the curriculum. And so this is the way things have gone over the years, or the past century or so, and really ever since Darwin, is that we've set up this dichotomy that you're either a Darwinianism or a Darwinian, or you are an intelligent designer or a creationist. And it seems as if, to a lot of people, including me, that we probably could use a third choice here between Darwinianism and creationism. And my guest today has written an amazing book. It's called Evolution 2.0 that does just that. He really attacks both sides of this dichotomy, of this debate, and comes up with something original. His name is Perry Marshall. He's an author, speaker, engineer, and a renowned business consultant working out of Chicago. Now, what's interesting about Perry is that he's worked in digital communications, control systems, acoustics, and e-commerce. And so he's bringing an original perspective to this debate. He has other books, including 80/20 Sales and Marketing, Ultimate Guide of Google AdWords, and Industrial Ethernet. He has a degree in electrical engineering and has consulted with more than 300 industries, from computer, hardware, and software to healthcare and finance. And so today we're going to be really taking a fresh look at this debate with an original thinker who's outside the box. Perry, welcome to the show.
Thank you. And Philip, thank you for having me on. You've got a pretty interesting list of guests that have been on the show, including John Hands, who introduced us. John's book is amazing. And you also, during your interview with him, you mentioned several other books that I think are great. You mentioned The Science Delusion by Rupert Sheldrake, great book. You mentioned Biocentrism by Robert Lanza, which that book led me to hunt down Ben Bella Books and get them as a publisher for Evolution 2.0 because they published his book too. And I really love this interdisciplinary approach. You're an attorney. Attorneys' jobs is whatever the field, whatever the situation, to go hunt and find the facts and defend them. So I think we're going to have a great conversation today.
Okay, well, thank you for that, and it's always refreshing to have an original thinker here. And so let's get going here for a second. First of all, what got you interested in this evolution debate?
Well, first, I had avoided it for a long time because when you know that there's a very nuanced subject that everybody's arguing about, and you know you're not an expert, and you know you don't have a degree, you're probably going to tend to shy away. But I ended up getting in an argument with my brother, of all people, who in 4 years he had gone from master's degree in theology from a seminary to missionary to almost atheist. And we're sitting here having this argument, and he has completely turned his worldview upside down, and he's dragging me with him. And this argument had actually been going on for a couple of years, and it had encompassed all kinds of topics. And I was just feeling more and more uncomfortable, and less I feel like I was certain of anything. And what I ended up grabbing onto as sort of the last edge of the ledge was science. And I guess it's only natural that I would do that because I'm an engineer. And as an engineer, I know certain things. And I really sort of decided I'm going to let science answer this question for me. And I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it goes. And I don't know where it's going to take me. This could make me an atheist. It could make me an agnostic. I suppose it could make me a Buddhist or something else. I had been a Christian. That was kind of scary. Maybe this is going to be some like weird arguments around the Thanksgiving table in the future. I don't know. But I'm going to leap into the void. And so that's what I did. And I had no idea how fascinating this was going to get. No idea whatsoever.
Well, I find that one of the problems we have in our modern society, and we have a lot of them, but on the intellectual field, we have a lot of people who just take things for granted. For example, if Richard Dawkins writes something about evolution, therefore it must be true. If Stephen Hawking says something about black holes, therefore we must care about that. If the leading universities teach Neo-Darwinianism, then therefore that must be correct. And so we have this problem. This is one of my big issues, is that we accept a lot of these scientific theories without question. And that is a major part of the problem. And I think part of the fun of this, and this is something I think you do, which is that if you say, okay, time out, I'm going to look at this issue of evolution, origin of life, with an open mind, and I'm going to try to remove my biases, my preconceptions, and just look at the facts. It's amazingly interesting, and I thought that's what was refreshing about your beginnings. And let's face it, Perry, a lot of people are skeptical that can be done. So how?
Yeah.
So how did you prepare yourself for this? Because clearly we all come into big questions with baggage, and the older you get, the harder it is to get rid of that baggage, I think. So what did you do?
You know, a big part of my professional work is marketing, and as a marketer, I can tell you that one of the strongest ways that humans make decisions is social proof. It's human authority. It's like, well, what what do the authoritative people say, right?
Right.
What does the Journal of the American Medical Association say, or what does Tom Cruise say? This is why celebrities endorse tennis shoes. Okay, so and it's a big, and for the most part, it's one of the more, it's somewhat reliable. Okay, it seems to put, it seems to work for most people most of the time, but I really had to set that aside because I could sit there and I could watch the ping pong ball go back and forth between all these authorities. And at some point you have to go, well, what can I find out? Well, what it really went down to, I had done this before, and I had done it in college writing an acoustics paper. And if anybody's ever seen a Bose wave radio, for example, it uses a very unusual kind of enclosure that engineers call a transmission line, and it's much more complicated and difficult than the regular approaches. And I wanted to figure out how to model it, and basically, in order to do it, like nobody had really done this to my satisfaction, and so I had to start over. I had to do it from scratch. And the thing about it was you couldn't just like build something, stick a microphone in front of it and come up with a theory. That would never give you the answer. What you had to do was start literally with the laws of physics, like Newton's law, force equals mass times acceleration, and then combine all of the things, the density of air and all this, and come up with the answer. And I did come up with the answer, and I did it right. And it was very painstaking. It's like, okay, you have to go back to, rubbing sticks together to make fire. Okay. Like discard civilization and start over. I mean, that's kind of what I was doing. Yeah. And it was a huge pain in the butt, and it was very tedious, but in the end, it was very satisfying. It's like, I know that F equals ma. So let's start with that. And you could derive this whole big complicated thing. And I knew what that felt like, and that is the certainty of science as applied by an engineer. Every cell phone, every Apple iPhone that rolls off the assembly line is a triumph of scientific testing and thinking and theory, and like all the theories about how the transistors work may not be entirely correct, but they're correct enough that the phones work. And I said, okay, Darwinism is actually an engineering theory. It's a theory about how things get engineered. And so I ought to be able to get to the bottom of this. You ought to be able to know. You ought to be able to get past like just having your head bounce back and forth between this authority and that authority. And that's what I did. And it was so satisfying to at a certain point, and I could get into the story of how I finally did touch the bottom of the swimming pool, and I knew where I could start to get to the bottom of this. And that's really where it began. Okay, so and most people have never done this, but it can be done.
Well, let's set the table here a little bit more, because we're talking about one of the leading theories in science, if not the leading theory, which is evolution. And it's amazing to me, for example, how so much that is unknown, such as the beginning of the universe and the change in time over the universe, diseases, viruses, how much science ascribes the movement of the physical world, the change of the physical world, to the concept of evolution. It's like the go-to default concept of science, but so few people really understand the workings of Darwin. And this is where things get interesting. And so what I'd like you to do is, because you do such a good job of this in your book, let's talk about, for those who don't really understand Darwin and just think it's some kind of, unalterable theory here, what are the core principles of Darwinianism or Neo-Darwinianism that you focus on and that you find fault with? So let's talk about the core elements here, so we set this up for a little discussion.
So let's start with what Darwin did and didn't do.
Okay.
What Darwin came up with is actually very simple. He said, hey, instead of everything being created individually, every species was a miraculous creation. Species came from each other, descent with modification. So, dog gives birth to another dog, but the new dog is different, and some of the differences are better and some of them are worse. And the better ones survive and the worse ones don't. That's called natural selection, and there you go. And essentially, that's what Darwin's theory was. And Darwin didn't understand cells. He didn't understand DNA. He didn't understand genetics. He didn't understand any of that. He just had this descent with modification, with natural selection, selecting things. And as a wide, broad, generalized umbrella theory, it was fine. Now, it didn't really explain where anything came from, and furthermore, it didn't explain where the modifications came from, so it didn't really explain much of anything, okay? It was just a different lens of looking at everything. Well, so I don't really have any disagreement with what Darwin originally came up with. Darwin wasn't an atheist. He also didn't have any idea where the first cell came from. Furthermore, he had a ridiculously oversimplified conception of what a cell actually was. So he didn't actually get that far. Well, then in the 30s and the 40s, some people came up with the Neo-Darwinian Synthesis, and they said, well, actually what's going on is we sort of kind of understand genes and chromosomes, although they still really didn't. And what happens is there's copying errors and there's just random changes in these genes, and that's where all the variation comes from. And then we throw in like Mendelian genetics, like which kind, what color of peas is going to grow, that whole piece. We stick those two things together, and we have a unified theory of evolution, and we triumphantly bang the drum and we say we've got this all figured out. Well, the randomness part was wrong, and this is where I could be absolutely certain as an engineer that this was wrong. Now I got to back up and I got to say, so I have this argument with Brian, and we're in this little bus in China, and we're arguing about. All of a sudden, we're arguing about science and evolution, which I didn't know that much about. But I go, Brian, look at the hand at the end of your arm. Like, this is a really fine piece of engineering. I said, you don't think that's just a random collection of accumulated accidents, do you? And he goes, hold on, buddy. He goes, hold on. Let's say there's a million falcons or a billion falcons flying around. Every now and then, one of them has a mutation in its genes, and maybe it gives it better eyesight, so then it can outcompete all the other falcons, and pretty soon it takes over the population, and then all the falcons are better. He says, yes, that can happen, and no, like, you don't need a designer for your hand or your arm. Well, I wasn't sure that I bought that, but what I knew was that A, I knew most biologists would agree with him and not with me. And B, I didn't know. And C, engineering and science have all kinds of crazy surprises in them that nobody would ever believe unless they went to the depth. And so I knew I didn't know. And I just knew I didn't know. I said, I'm going to find out. And either the biologists know something the engineers don't, or the engineers know something the biologists don't, because I've never seen anybody in engineering design anything this way. I designed the speakers of the 94 Ford Probe, the 95 Jeep Cherokee, the 95 Acura Vigor, the 96 Dodge Stratus, for example. And then, later I worked in automation. I've never seen anybody design anything the Darwinian way. So who's right? And away I went.
So this is a really good way to describe the debate and the conflict here, because stripped to its essence, Darwinianism is based upon the quote-unquote natural selection of favorable random mutations. And a lot of people think, well, that's fine, and if you give something a billion years, like your brother was saying, Brian,
Yep.
if you give something a billion years, well, who knows, anything could happen kind of thing. And so it's sort of like, it sounds like a very sort of questionable theory to anybody, I think, to when you throw the word random in there. But then the time element comes in, and to me it's like a lot of hand waving or hocus pocus that time is going to cure the problem. But
Yeah.
it actually is deeper than that. And so let's move on here. How did you proceed to evaluate this theory of random mutations?
Well, what I found out was that time is your enemy, not your friend,
Yeah.
in this situation.
Yeah, that's good.
And so I wanted to know, okay, what can a random mutation do? What can it accomplish? Is it possible for random changes in DNA to eventually accumulate into better eyes and better arms and wings and all this other stuff? And so I was floundering. I mean, for quite a while, I was really just, I have an obsessive personality, and you can look at my other work, and I've done a lot of other things. So I go buy dozens of books, and I'm reading all these websites, and I'm reading both sides, and I'm looking for sides that aren't even on either side, and I'm just going crazy. But I'm lost. And finally, one day, it was this epiphany moment. And by the way, in your book, The Collapse of Materialism, you talk about epiphanies. Right. And I had one. And it was like brain on fire. And here's what it was, which was in 2002, I wrote a book called Industrial Ethernet for the world's largest professional Society of Process Control Engineers. It's called the ISA. And I wrote a book called Industrial Ethernet, and this is how the ones and zeros go across the wire. Because I worked in industrial networking for 6 years. The company I worked for designed a chip. I was deeply involved in the industry, and this was in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the world was on fire with going digital. And so I wrote this book for process engineers on how ones and zeros go across an Ethernet cable, which that probably sounds like a really great sleeping pill for most people to read a book like that. But when you peel the layers, it actually is very interesting, and it's an amazing technical accomplishment that everybody now takes for granted, that you can just drive down the expressway talking on your cell phone. You have no idea all the technology that's making all those messages go back and forth, and it's really amazing, and it's really fascinating. And what I realized was, and it was like bam, brain on fire moment. I'm reading about DNA. I'm reading about chromosomes, the genetic code, start codons, stop codons, all of this. Bam! I'm like, oh my word. DNA information and digital packets on the internet are almost the same thing. In fact, mathematically, they are identical. The formal term in science for this is isomorphism. It is the basic mathematical properties of the two systems are identical. Okay, and these exist all over the place, and engineers use them all the time. In fact, I used isomorphisms to solve my acoustics problem, where when I would get stuck on the acoustics part, I would open an electromagnetic fields and waves book. I would figure out how they solved them, electromagnetic waves, and then I would go back to the acoustic waves, and it would solve my problem. And engineers do this all the time, like, oh my word, I can figure this out. This is digital code. This is code. In fact, so DNA, it has words in the genetic language that say start a message here. They have words that say stop a message here. There is redundancy where a message is backed up multiple ways, it's transmitted multiple ways so that if one is broken, the other one stays fixed. There are checksums which ensure that the message got sent correctly. There are error correction systems that say, hey, this is wrong, go back and fix it. Oh my word, this is crazy. I can study evolution as a software engineering problem. I can study evolution as a digital code problem. In fact, all the way since the 30s and 40s, these guys have been saying it's just random modifications of digital code, and that makes evolution. And I said, I can figure this out. Wow. And I mean, talk about, like, that's got to be one of the top 5 brain on fire moments that I've ever had my whole entire life, when I connected these two worlds. And it took about 10 seconds to see the connection. And then I've spent the next 10 years connecting the dots. Yep. This is the same. This is the same. Now, there's other things that are different. This is not the same. This is not the same. This is not the same. But I actually came up with this catalog of these things are the same. These things are different. And you can have a definitive answer to this question of, does traditional Darwinian evolution work?
Okay, so this is Philip Comella. This is Conversations Beyond Science and Religion. I'm speaking with Perry Marshall, the author of a brand new, fascinating, and groundbreaking book. It's called Evolution 2.0, Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design. And we're talking about the mysteries of the DNA code and the similarity between DNA and digital code. And I'd like to say something here, that how important this is, because it seems to me, Perry, that our modern evolutionists, and I will use Richard Dawkins as the personification of this, although he's not the only one, but he's sort of good to put up there to represent this side of the debate. To me, they take so much for granted in evaluating evolution. And the number one thing I think you put your finger on, and I would completely agree, and that is the intelligence of the DNA molecule. It's as if they assume that nature just happened to plop down this molecule that hands out codes for how to build living things on the Earth, and this is just something that happens to be there. And then they could watch it do all of its magical things, such as creating organisms and creating change, and without even recognizing that the information and intricacies of this molecule essentially boggle the mind. And so to me, Perry, this is extremely important, and I really resonate with what you're saying here, because it's a function of certain scientists taking something so amazing for granted. And so I like, and I think you bring something to this because of your background. Why don't you just talk a little bit about how you compared the DNA code with other codes and what that really means?
So what is a code? A code is when a symbol represents something other than itself. So when you press A on your computer keyboard, a 10000001 goes through a circuit and into a chip, and then an A appears on your screen. And if it's a B, then it's like a 10000010. And so 10001 is A, and 10010 is B. And there's a table, and you can look it up. And so you make a little table. It's like, this is A, and that corresponds to 10001. And then when those bits come back, then we translate it back into an A. And so you have the symbol and the referent and the referent and the symbol. And all codes work this way, and all languages work this way. And we create codes every time we invent a new acronym. We create codes every time there's a new word in the English language. When you have a little piece of slang that just you and your friends came up with, all of that is codes, and we're swimming in codes. And there's zip codes and barcodes and QR codes and and HTML and PHP and in everything, every single file format on your computer, whether it's a Excel spreadsheet or a Word document or an MP3 file, they are all just different kinds of codes, and each one has a different language. So .mp3 is a language, and .doc is a language, and .xls is a language, and .html is a language. They're all just codes. And everybody actually understands codes, at least to some level. Well, DNA is a code too. GGG is code to make glycine. AAA is code to make lysine. And you can look at any genetic table, any genetic code table in any biology book, and there it is right there. And when DNA is transcribed into RNA and then translated into amino acids, that's an encoding decoding process. And so this is very, very, very well understood. It's the cornerstone of the entire information age that we live in right now. This Skype conversation that we're having is possible because of it. The internet is possible because of it. It's because of the ABC 1, 2, 3s of digital codes. And so okay, so it's all ones and zeros. And so where do the ones and zeros come from, and how do ones and zeros get built? Well, this led to a really interesting question. I said, okay, so Darwinism says, a dog has puppies, and the DNA from the dog to the puppies, there's an accidental copying error. So this is like Richard Dawkins 101. This is Jerry Coyne 101. Dog has puppies. Puppies get DNA that's slightly corrupted from copying errors, and copying errors accumulate, and most of them are bad, some of them are neutral, and a few of them are good, and you get better dogs and better dogs and better dogs, and you get evolution. Presto, it's so simple. Isn't that great? Well, so I have a question for everybody. How come software never gets written that way? We have an entire internet with who knows how many trillions or gajillions of gigabytes of files all over the place, and they're getting copied back and forth all the time, and people are driving up and down expressways talking on their cell phones all the time. So how come the signals don't occasionally get better when there's copying errors? How come the software doesn't occasionally get better when there's copying errors, and then we'll just use natural selection to clean it up?
Yeah.
And how come Microsoft needs employees when, according to Darwinian theory, they should just need to buy a few million servers, mutate copies of software programs, and spit out the good ones and keep the good ones and get rid of the bad ones, and then evolution would be automatic? How come nobody writes software the way Richard Dawkins says life evolves?
Yep.
Why?
That's a good question. Yep. Yeah, I think I think you're the first person to raise that question, and I think that sort of exposes, as you know, that exposes a lot of the problem here, which is that those who hold up natural selection and random mutation as being the quote-unquote blind watchmaker have, to me, a little overstated the case, and you sort of segue from the point you're making into this notion of noise, which I'd like you to talk about, because this is connected to this to me misconception that mutations can create a new organism, or I mean, the way I look at it is to think that an amoeba is going to convert itself into Cary Grant over a couple billion years is a little ridiculous. I mean, it's not a little ridiculous; it's a lot ridiculous. But from your experience with noise in the electrical engineering world, what did that do for you in evaluating this problem?
So let me back up a step and let me acknowledge that I have now stated that Richard Dawkins and friends are saying something that's totally ridiculous, but I want to acknowledge that some people aren't ready to agree with me.
Right.
Okay, so okay, I respect you. Like you're going, well, but yeah, but in millions of years and billions of cells and stuff, like who knows what could happen, and you're back to that time thing. Okay, so let me explain what the problem with that is. There's a very serious problem with it, and here's what it is. So you and I, we're on Skype. I got my headphones on. I'm talking to the microphone, and I've got this digital signal. It's going from me to you to where you live and back and forth. Okay, now our computers, or we could be on walkie-talkies, right? Or we could be on an analog telephone line. We could be we could be mailing cassette tapes back and forth, like whatever it is. Noise is always our enemy. There is always static interference. There's always, random noise from the sun. There's always somebody running an arc welder, or there's always a car driving by, and it's always interfering with your signal. Okay, now an uneducated person doesn't really know whether that can ever help you. Well, in communication engineering, there's this guy named Claude Shannon, and he figured out all of the mathematics of communication in 1948 in a paper called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. And he defined all this stuff, and he got it down to a very simple, rigorous theory. And it was extremely good. I mean, this is literally one of the top 10 engineering papers of the 20th century, I would say. Absolutely brilliant, and there's nothing controversial about it. It laid the foundation for the digital age we now live in. And he discovered something called information entropy, which is, he goes, yeah, I got this walkie-talkie, or I got the Skype connection, and I'm trying to talk to Phil, and there's all this noise going on. How does the noise affect me, and how do I get my signal through without the noise damaging it? Well, the thing he discovered was information entropy is exactly the same math. The formula is identical for thermodynamic entropy. Now, what's thermodynamic entropy? Thermodynamic entropy says when the toast pops out of the toaster, it always gets colder, never hotter. Okay? Yep. Never. When you add noise to a signal, it always destroys the signal. It never makes it better, ever. Now, I could go into a big mathematical explanation, which I will not, but I'll just put it this way. In practical terms, in electrical engineering, in the people that design cell phones, the people that design radio towers and all that kind of stuff, the concept of adding noise to a signal to make it better does not exist. You will never find it anywhere. Now, there's a few related ideas, like dither, for example, which I don't think we have time for, that they are slightly related, and an uneducated person could think they're an exception. They're not an exception. The concept of adding noise to a signal to make it better does not exist any more than toast ever gets warmer after the pops out of the toaster. Noise always destroys, and I could go into the math and statistics of it, which I won't because I don't think that's appropriate for a podcast. My book has a chapter called All About Randomness. It's Appendix 1, and if you want to see a rigorous treatment of this, go there. It's in the appendix, not the main part, for a reason. But it doesn't exist. When you're in a recording studio, and whether you're using 8-track tapes, reel-to-reel, digital, vinyl, noise is always, always, always your enemy. And what I realized was what the Darwinians are saying is we add a little noise to the signal with every generation, and 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of 1,000,000 will be better. No, it will always destroy your signal. Now, this makes it really interesting because here's what I found. A lot of other people kind of sort of figured this out, especially on the creationist side, and they stopped and they said, therefore, evolution is a hoax. I didn't stop there. I found a whole world opened up to me when I found out, well, yeah, but see, there's a twist. There's this whole other thing going on that you never hear about from Richard Dawkins or Jerry Coyne or any of these Darwinian fundamentalists that are writing textbooks and educating the public about this. There's this whole other story that nobody's hearing at all. And that's where it got interesting.
Okay, so this is a good time for sort of a pause, and this is what we've done up to now, which is that the orthodox Darwinian interpretation of evolution says that evolution occurs through the natural selection of random mutation. And for those who I think apply common sense, to me that's always been a bit suspicious. Even for a person on the street, random mutations, it just sounds weird. And what Perry is doing here is comparing this notion of random mutations to this electrical engineering and computer concept of noise, and reaching the conclusion that as in terms of mathematics and logic, noise or mutations cannot create something better. It's only going to be worse, which I think is a really important step, Perry, as we talked about in the beginning, because at the same time that the Darwinians basically say time heals all wounds, it's really the opposite, as you point out in the beginning. Time makes noise worse. It's only going to corrupt the data. It's not going to lead to something better. But as you say, this is where things get interesting, because indeed things do get better. There is evolution.
They do.
There is evolution. So what? So that leads to, well, what is the mechanism? So why don't you explain? Because then you look closely at the workings of the cell, and you sort of came up with your switchblade approach here that we have time to summarize, and then we're going to move on to a little bigger topic. But let's why don't you talk about what you found when you did look closer at this problem?
So I knew that in order for some cell 3 billion years ago to survive to now, let alone multiply into all the different ecosystems and diversity, and just to survive, it would have to have error correction. And I knew this. There's no way that code could survive without error correction. So where is it? And I started looking for it, and somebody sent me a paper, and it was by James Shapiro, and he was talking about Barbara McClintock. And I suddenly found exactly what, as a communication engineer, I expected to find, but more. And what I found out was that cells actually repair their own DNA when it's damaged, just like Ethernet routers and hubs and switches. Okay? The equipment in your house that does your Wi-Fi, it repairs broken packets or has them resent when there's a problem. So, somebody turns on a blender and there's all this static going on in your house. All that equipment is compensating. Well, I found out cells do the same thing. And Barbara McClintock, in the 1940s, she was a geneticist, and she was doing these experiments with corn plants, and she was hitting corn with radiation in order to damage the chromosomes and see what would happen. And this was equivalent to running an arc welder next to your Ethernet router in your house and seeing what happens when the packets come in and out. And what the plant did was what your Ethernet router does, which the plant repaired the damage. But the plant actually did something that nobody's Ethernet router knows how to do. The plant came up with a repair. It couldn't restore the original, and so it reconstructed something different, possibly even better, and the plant went on and reproduced. Now, this was flat out astonishingly amazing. Like, oh my word, what? And it was so incredible that when she presented her paper at a science symposium in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, all of her colleagues were a combination of amused and angry that she would even suggest that a cell can rearrange and restructure its own genetics. But in fact, that's what happened. And 40 years later, she won the Nobel Prize.
Wow.
Okay, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Because in Evolution 2.0, I describe it as a Swiss Army knife, that cells have a battery, a Swiss Army knife of different mechanisms that they can use to not only repair but restructure and re-engineer themselves. And the Swiss Army knife has 5 blades. One of them is transposition, which is what Barbara McClintock got a Nobel Prize for discovering. One of them is epigenetics, which is cells switching genes on and off, like graying them out or silencing them, kind of like pull-down menus in a software program getting grayed out. Like sometimes you can get to them, sometimes you can't. There's one called hybridization, which is when 2 species merge together and they double the number of chromosomes, which is it's actually quite common, and botanists use it all the time. There's one called symbiogenesis, which is cellular merger acquisitions, that's another amazing thing. And then there's horizontal gene transfer, which is cells actually exchanging DNA with one another, which is why you have to finish your antibiotics or the bugs become superbugs. Now, I just spit out like these 5 different things. Every single one of them is a big enough topic for 100 PhD theses. So, I mean, this is a giant mouthful, but what I found was empirically, demonstrably, organisms rearrange their own DNA. They cut it, they splice it, they reprogram it, they change their own genetics, and they do things that nobody in the software or engineering world knows how to do with human technology. And so this was just exponentially more amazing than anything the Darwinists were talking about or anything the creationists were talking about. And I said, oh my word, why isn't anybody talking about this? Like, why isn't this front page news?
Okay.
So I don't get it. What's the problem here?
Okay, so this is a really good, because now we're getting to really the big issues. What you've described, it can be summarized as being an intelligent cell or a mechanism that we can only describe less metaphorically, perhaps, which puts this urge for survival inside the cell or inside some other thing in the body. I'm just going to call it the cell for the time being, because we know that there is this, and this, I have a philosophy background, and so there is a lot of this comes from some earlier philosophers, that, the will to live, which is William James, the will to survive. There's this spiritual urging that is hard to describe in materialistic terms that everybody has. The will to live is a really, I think we all have it, and it seems as if the cell itself, with this switchblade you just summarized, has this urge to survive, to adapt, and to survive. And the big point here, and it should not be lost on the listeners, which is, this sure sounds like something intelligent or something goal-oriented, or both, as opposed to just a random walk in the park. And so what is this? The big question, and you just put your finger on it, Perry, which is, why haven't the Neo-Darwinianisms or Darwinians, why haven't the Richard Dawkins of the world focused on these mechanisms? What do you think?
So Darwinism and natural selection has actually become a big, giant rug that you sweep unanswered questions under, but it's not actually an explanation at all. So when somebody says, I believe in evolution through natural selection, that's like saying, I believe in business success through bankruptcy. Like, well, okay, that's like a half truth. I mean, it is true that for every one Starbucks, there's like 10,000 other coffee chains that did go out of business. But it doesn't explain why Starbucks is successful. Okay? And similarly, yes, like let's not underestimate natural selection. Okay, has anybody ever been in one of those multi-level marketing deals where they show you how, well, if you just get one person every month and all your people get one person every month, you're going to double, and you go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, and by the end of the year you'll have 16 million distributors. Yes. Right? Well, that sounds good, and a naive person believes that, but they don't realize like how much stuff doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Similarly, you ought to be able to breed 2 rabbits in your backyard and have 16 million rabbits in 2 years, but you're not going to have 16 million rabbits in 2 years because wolves are going to come and eat them and all this other stuff. And so like natural selection really does put a damper on the party. I mean, make no question about it. And it is a very powerful shaping force, but it's only the last step. You haven't explained anything whatsoever about how you get an eye or an arm or a hand or anything else like that. And so what neo-Darwinists do is they take the effect and they try to turn it into a cause. They completely demolish cause and effect, and they just say, oh yeah, business success through bankruptcy, business success through bankruptcy, business success through bankruptcy. And it just avoids them having to answer the real questions. But the real question is exactly, Phil, what you just described. Like, well, what is this will to live? What is this willfulness that life possesses? I mean, you can go to YouTube and search for white blood cells eating germs, and you can watch those suckers. I mean, is anybody going to sit here and tell me that that's not purposeful? Yeah. Okay. Well, what most people don't know is just as purposefully and goal-oriented as cells are in, eating germs in your bloodstream, they also modify their own DNA in real time. I mean, this happens all the time. If you take your cup of coffee and with some cream and sugar in it and leave it on the table for a few days, in about a week, you're going to have a bacteria culture growing on top of that. Well, if we take an eyedropper and put some poison in the top of that coffee, the edges of that bacterial colony, those cells will rearrange, they'll change their DNA. Some of them will intentionally die or even kill themselves if necessary, in order to protect the colony from the poison in the top of your coffee cup. And they do this all the time. There's a lot of work by a lot of people. James Shapiro would be a leading person in this field, showing that cells alter their DNA and the expression of their DNA all the time. And so in actuality, even though the Darwinians want you to think that we basically understand evolution, and we have understood it for most of a century, the truth is we only understand like maybe 1 to 5% of what's actually going on with evolution, and the rest of it is a giant mystery.
And this is extremely important, I think, revealing, because as you point out, evolution is sort of like the all-purpose explanatory tool for science, and to me it is getting a bit old, a bit tiring, that everything is being explained by evolution. Sometimes I'm reading something, I'm thinking, well, if you just replace the word God every time you see evolution, it's basically the same thing, where it's like the God of the gaps. It's the God of the gaps for science, evolution, that is. And I think that the only way we're going to make progress here in putting together a more systematic, logical science is by questioning these things. In my own book, The Collapse of Materialism, I talk about how it's really an inconsistent theory, because science says that the universe began with chaos. The chaos creates somehow this structured DNA molecule, which is clearly intelligent, but this DNA molecule with this code generates nonsense, but then the nonsense generates ordered structures. So you go from chaos to order to chaos to order. It doesn't make any sense. And I like your approach, which is also very close to my approach, which is that if you're consistent, you're going to say, well, there was some intelligence behind the cell. There is some intelligence behind the cell, which is why we have ordered creatures in an ordered universe. You don't have to pretend as if being scientific means bending or relying upon randomness, which I think is a reaction against sort of biblical literalism. But now, since we're coming to the end, I want to go to the big question here, which is that, you started, or maybe you still are a Christian, and you started your quest with this open mind, and you reached the conclusions in your book, most of which we didn't have time to cover. But what do you think is the source of this information, or the ordered cell? Where are you now in your thinking between the intelligent design school and the Neo-Darwinian school? Where are you after your quest?
So I think in order to answer these questions productively, you have to embrace a little bit of paradox. And for me, here's what it is. So we do not know any way to get a code without intelligence, and that's a fact. And early, if you go back 10 years, and some of this stuff is on my website and some of the different talks I've given, my early approach was DNA is a code. All of the other codes are that we know the origin of are designed. We got this one code, we don't know where it came from, therefore it's designed, therefore God. Now, up to a certain point, I'm fine with that. However, there is a problem, and I think it really is a problem, which is, there isn't a scientist alive who gets to say, God did it, that settles it, let's go have a 3-martini lunch.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And somebody like Isaac Newton or Boyle or any of the classical scientists, most of whom were Christians, they would recoil at that. They would no, you don't just get to say, well, God made it that way. Isaac Newton would say, no, you have to understand the mechanism behind it. You don't get to say, oh, God made the apple fall out of the tree. You have to go discover gravity. Okay? Your job as a Christian, your job as a worshiper is to figure out what's going on here in this universe God made, not just assign a miraculous explanation to everything. Now, what's been going on in the creation evolution debate is it's really the creationist miracles versus the Richard Dawkins miracles. They're both miracles.
Right.
Okay. A random mutation is not even a scientific theory. Why? Because you can't prove randomness in the first place, which is a whole nother topic, which we don't have time for. What you can do is you can say, I believe that we live in a universe that somehow is divinely ordered and that we can discover more and more and more and more. We can peel the onion, another layer, and another layer, and we never stop finding layers and we never stop finding order, but you have to look for order in order to find it. Now, Darwinism doesn't look for order. It looks for random accidents, and then it claims it found them, and then it stops. And that's why Darwinism is incredibly lazy.
Yeah.
It is just as lazy as the creationism that it allegedly to replace. And what you really have is you have two religions battling each other. and neither has any way of proving that itself is true. And so they're just faith systems. There's just belief systems. And what I said was, I want to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And this actually led me to create a technology prize called the Evolution 2.0 Prize, which is currently at $3 million. And it's a search for a code that's not designed. And what I realized was the only way you solve this is you lay down the gauntlet and you say, I'm looking for empirical proof. Somebody show me how you get a code without designing one. Maybe there's a way. And if you can solve this, this would be hugely valuable. So I organized a group of private equity investors. You can go to naturalcode.org and you can read all about it. But I think that goes straight down the middle. You cannot ignore the questions or the gaps that we have in science. And you can't just assume that they're impossible to solve. You have to use the scientific method. And when you do that, science stops being a religion and it stays science.
And I think this is a really good way to conclude the show, because we tend to think that a scientist, and really it's the materialistic scientists of the Dawkins and Hawking vein that I'm talking about here, that they are the purveyors of all knowledge and that they're practicing something other than religion. But when you actually, as you say, peel the onion, we find out that modern science, and Darwinianism is probably the leading example, is based upon a set of unquestioned assumptions. And it's only by questioning those assumptions that I think we get to a pure and more logically consistent form of science. Then to me, Perry, the problem is that the same one that Darwin started with and the same one that permeates our curriculums, which is that science considers its adversary biblical literalism, and it pretends as if the opponent is Jesus Christ, or is somebody that's taking the words of Genesis literally. We need to move beyond that simple dichotomy and realize that there may be a third way to explain this. And I think that your work, Evolution 2.0, Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design, is really a step in that direction, folks, is because it's showing that when you're critical of both sides of the debate, we may be able to reach a middle ground here, or something that I would say transcends, goes beyond science and religion, goes beyond Darwinianism and intelligent design, to something that starts making more sense. And the last point I'm going to make, Perry, and I'll let you comment on it, even though I'm extending my conclusion here, is that, to me, science has to get out of its head that they can't be scientific and have an intelligence in the curriculum. This is the problem. They think that practicing science means getting rid of anything that's called a mind, God, divine, spirit, that's all of a sudden that's unscientific. And that, to me, is the problem. They can't, and this is why they cannot give up this random mutation thing, in my opinion. So I'll let you comment on that, and then tell us about your website and how folks can find your book.
Yeah, well, I think that all the acid you need to kill Darwinism is electrical engineering.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
If the Darwinists were right, Bill Gates would not have to have a payroll.
Yeah.
Okay, he could buy 10 million servers and just grind away.
Yeah.
There's a chapter in my book about genetic algorithms, which there's a whole entire science of computer programs that use Darwinian processes to improve code, but they're not Neo-Darwinian. They're Evolution 2.0 type processes. And so really, an electrical engineer is a reductionist in the sense that, we believe in the laws of physics and we do all that stuff. But in another sense, if you want to create something, you have to create it, and so to me, there's not really any conflict. And the job of anybody is to follow the evidence where it leads. And if the evidence shows that there's intelligence somewhere, then let's go find it.
Right.
If the cell appears to be intelligent, then let's figure out how it's intelligent. Let's not deny the obvious.
Right.
I mean, it's very obvious to any 6-year-old that cats and dogs and even white blood cells chasing germs around are in some sense intelligent. So let's get to it.
Yeah, and
and that's what we need to do.
Yeah, and I think that is the moral of the story, which is follow the evidence. If the evidence leads to a designer, which it does, and I do not mean, for those wondering, a God in heaven, nor do I mean Jesus Christ. I mean an intelligence, a mind behind creation, and that is where the evidence leads. And it's like I said in the beginning of the show, or maybe before the show, Perry. I personally have belief that that when all the debate is over, the truth remains standing, and that is what the process of science is about. So, thank you for your time. It's been a very quick hour plus, but there's a lot to cover here. We'll probably have to have you back. You mentioned your website to find your book. I take it that's Amazon and elsewhere.
Yes, so you can get 3 free chapters of Evolution 2.0 at cosmicfingerprints.com, and you can buy the book on Amazon. And I really want to invite you, whether you're a technical person or whether you're a philosopher or whatever, this book, it's written at a high school level. It's the first time anybody has taken these blades of the Swiss Army knife, as I call them, which have been known for the most part for 50 years. There's a whole bunch of science that most people just aren't hearing, and it's very well established. There's nothing controversial about transposition. Nothing controversial about the fact that cells rearrange their DNA. Any competent biologist knows this, but the public hasn't heard it. I explain this in language that regular people can understand. I've got appendices in the background for technical people, or you can go deeper. And I think this will change the way you see the whole entire world.
And I agree. This is another one of those must-have books for those who want to open their minds and really go beyond the orthodox science and religious views of the world. This is Philip Comella. This is Conversations Beyond Science and Religion. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Conversations Beyond Science and Religion, hosted by Philip Comella. To find out more about Philip and his book, The Collapse of Materialism, visit thecollapseofmaterialism.com.